The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside the dusty trading post in Greeley, Colorado territory. And Garrett Hawkins looked up from the saddle he was mending just in time to see a young woman being half carried, half dragged from the coach by the driver, her feet wrapped in blood-soaked bandages that had once been white but were now the color of rust. "Someone help," the driver called out, his weathered face creased with concern. "This lady needs aid." Garrett dropped the leather strap in his hands and strode across the packed dirt street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust in the late afternoon sun of July 1876. He reached the woman just as her knees buckled, catching her before she hit the ground. She was light in his arms, too light, and when her eyes fluttered open, they were the color of storm clouds over the Front Range. "I can walk," she whispered, but even those 3 words seemed to drain what little strength she had left. "Not on those feet, you cannot," Garrett said firmly, adjusting his grip so she was cradled more comfortably against his chest. "Driver, what happened?" "Found her walking along the trail about 15 miles back," the man said, shaking his head. "Said she had been walking for 3 days. Shoes gave out on the 2nd day. She paid her fare with the last coins she had." The woman's head lolled against Garrett's shoulder, and he felt her body go slack as consciousness slipped away from her. Her dark hair had come loose from whatever pins had held it, and it fell in tangled waves past his arm. She wore a simple calico dress that had seen better days, torn and stained with trail dust and what looked like dried blood. "Doc Morrison," Garrett said to a boy who had stopped to gawk. "Run and fetch him. Tell him to meet me at my place." The boy nodded and took off running down the street toward the doctor's office near the church. Garrett turned and began walking, the woman still secure in his arms. People stopped and stared as he passed, but he paid them no mind. His small house sat at the edge of town, just past the general store and the blacksmith shop. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a porch, but it was clean and quiet, and right now, that was what this woman needed. He kicked open the door and carried her inside, laying her gently on his bed. The afternoon light streamed through the single window, illuminating her face more clearly. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of a gentler life than whatever had brought her to this rough territory. Her hands were callous, though, and there were faint scars on her fingers that suggested she knew hard work. Doc Morrison arrived within minutes, his black bag in hand and his spectacles sliding down his nose as they always did. He was a good man, one of the few in Greeley who had actual medical training from back east. "Let me see those feet," the doctor said, setting his bag on the small table beside the bed. Garrett stepped back to give him room but did not leave. He watched as Doc Morrison carefully unwrapped the bandages, revealing blistered, torn flesh that made even the hardened doctor wince. The woman stirred but did not wake fully, just made a small sound of pain that went straight through Garrett's heart like an arrow. "She will live," Doc Morrison said after a thorough examination. "But these feet need time to heal and she will need care. Probably a month before she can walk properly again, maybe longer. Do you know who she is?" "Never seen her before," Garrett admitted. "Driver said she had been walking for 3 days. From where, I wonder?" the doctor mused as he cleaned the wounds with careful precision. "And why?" Those were questions Garrett wanted answered as well, but they would have to wait. He helped the doctor apply fresh bandages, and a salve that smelled of herbs and something sharper, probably whiskey. When they were done, the woman's feet were wrapped in clean white cloth, and her breathing had evened out into the deeper rhythm of sleep. "Someone will need to watch her," Doc Morrison said, washing his hands in the basin Garrett provided. "Change those bandages twice a day, keep her hydrated, and for heaven's sake, do not let her try to walk. Not for at least 2 weeks, and even then only with help. I will take care of her, Garrett heard himself say, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. The doctor raised an eyebrow but did not comment. He had known Garrett for 3 years, ever since the cowboy had settled in Greeley after a decade of driving cattle up from Texas. Garrett was known as a quiet man, honest and hardworking, but not one to involve himself in other people's troubles unnecessarily. I will check on her tomorrow, Doc Morrison said, packing up his bag. Send for me if she takes a fever or if those wounds start looking worse. After the doctor left, Garrett pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat down, studying the woman's face. In sleep, some of the pain had eased from her features, but he could still see the exhaustion etched into every line. She was pretty, he realized, though that thought felt somehow improper given the circumstances. Her lips were cracked from the sun and lack of water, and her skin had the flush of too much exposure to the elements. He rose and fetched a cup of water, along with a cloth he dampened in the basin. Gently, he moistened her lips and then wiped the dust from her face and hands. She did not wake, though her eyelids fluttered once or twice as if she were dreaming. The sun was setting by the time she finally stirred again. Garrett had moved to the stove to prepare some broth, thinking she would need something in her stomach when she woke. He heard her gasp and turned to find her eyes wide open, darting around the unfamiliar room in panic. "Easy," he said, moving quickly to her side. "You are safe. You are in Greeley in my home. I am Garrett Hawkins, and you collapsed when you got off the stagecoach." She stared at him for a long moment, her breathing rapid and shallow. Then her gaze dropped to her bandaged feet, and he saw memory return to her eyes, along with something that looked like defeat. "I made it," she whispered, and to his shock, tears began to slide down her cheeks. "I actually made it. Made it from where?" Garrett asked gently, pulling the chair closer so he could sit. "What is your name?" "Grace," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Grace Barrett. I came from Kansas." "That is a long way to walk, Miss Barrett." "The stage only went so far," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "I ran out of money in sterling. I thought I could walk the rest of the way. It did not look so far on the map." Garrett had seen plenty of people underestimate the distances in the West. Maps made it all look so simple, just a few inches between towns, but those inches translated to dozens of miles of unforgiving terrain under a merciless sun. "Why Greeley?" he asked. "Do you have family here?" Grace shook her head, wincing as the movement seemed to remind her of various aches and pains. "No family anywhere, not anymore, but I heard there was work here, that the town was growing and needed teachers. I was a teacher back in Kansas before." She trailed off, and her jaw tightened. "Before circumstances changed." Garrett wanted to press for more details, but the exhaustion in her eyes stopped him. Instead, he helped her sit up enough to sip some water, which she drank so eagerly he had to caution her to slow down. "Doc Morrison says you cannot walk for at least 2 weeks," he said. "Your feet need time to heal." "I cannot impose," Grace said immediately, panic creeping back into her voice. "I have no money to pay you and I need to find work. The school might hire someone else if I do not apply soon." "The school can wait," Garrett said firmly, "and you are not imposing. You can stay here until you are well enough to move about on your own." "But I cannot just live here with you," Grace protested, her cheeks flushing. "It is not proper. People will talk." "Let them talk," Garrett said with a shrug. "I've got a bed, you need a place to heal, and that is all there is to it. Besides, it is not like you can go anywhere else right now." He saw her struggle with this, pride warring with practicality. Finally, practicality won, as it usually did in the harsh reality of the frontier. "Just until I can walk," she said quietly. "And I will repay you somehow, I promise." We can worry about that later, Garrett said. Right now, you need to eat something. I have got broth warming, and there is bread from yesterday that is still good. He brought her the food, and she ate slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she held the bowl. Garrett found himself wanting to help, to hold the bowl for her, but he sensed she needed to do this herself. Grace Barrett struck him as someone who was not accustomed to being helpless. As she ate, he told her about Greeley, how the town had been founded just 5 years earlier as a temperance colony, though that particular aspect had loosened somewhat as more people arrived seeking opportunity in the Colorado Territory. He told her about the school, which did indeed need a teacher since Miss Hendricks had gotten married in the spring and moved to Denver with her new husband. So there really is a position available, Grace said, and for the first time, he saw hope flicker in those storm-gray eyes. There is, he confirmed, and I happen to know the superintendent of schools, Arthur Chen. He is a fair man. Once you are healed, I will introduce you. Why are you being so kind to me? Grace asked suddenly, setting down the half-empty bowl. You do not know me. I could be anyone. Garrett considered the question seriously. I suppose because someone helped me once when I needed it, and I figure it is my turn to pass that kindness along. And because leaving you to fend for yourself with feet like that would not be the action of a decent man. Grace studied him for a long moment, and he got the sense she was trying to take his measure, to determine if he was being truthful or if there was some ulterior motive hidden beneath his words. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Garrett, he corrected. If you are going to be staying in my house, we might as well use first names. Garrett, she repeated, and he found he liked the sound of his name in her voice. I am Grace. I know, he said with a small smile. You told me already. A hint of amusement touched her eyes. So I did. The sun must have affected my mind along with my feet. That night, Garrett made up a bedroll for himself on the floor of the front room, giving Grace his bed and what privacy he could offer. He lay awake for a long time, listening to her restless movements, the occasional soft gasp when she shifted, and her feet reminded her of their damaged state. He thought about the determination it must have taken to walk 3 days on increasingly ruined feet, and he wondered what could drive someone to such extremes. Grace had said circumstances had changed in Kansas. He had heard enough stories from other settlers and drifters to fill in the blanks with any number of possibilities, none of them pleasant. The next morning, he woke before dawn, as was his habit. He worked at the Fletcher Ranch most days, helping with their growing herd of cattle, but he had some money saved and could afford to miss a few days of work. He sent word to Frank Fletcher through a neighbor boy, explaining the situation in brief terms. Frank was a good boss, understanding about such things. Grace was awake when he came back inside, propped up against the pillows he had arranged for her, looking uncomfortable with her situation. I need to. She started, then stopped, her cheeks going red. Ah, Garrett said, understanding immediately. He had not thought about that particular difficulty. Right. Well, I suppose I could carry you to the outhouse. That is completely mortifying, Grace said, but there was no real option, and they both knew it. He tried to make it as dignified as possible, carrying her out the back way where fewer people would see, waiting nearby but turned away to give her what privacy he could. When he carried her back inside, her face was burning with embarrassment, but she thanked him quietly. I hate this, she said once she was settled back in bed. I hate being helpless. You are not helpless, Garrett said as he prepared breakfast, scrambling eggs and slicing more bread. You are healing. There is a difference. It does not feel different. I suppose not, he agreed, bringing her a plate. But your body did an incredible thing walking all that distance. Now it needs time to recover. That is not weakness, Grace. That is being human. She picked at her eggs, then started eating with more appetite. You are surprisingly philosophical for a cowboy. You have a notion about what cowboys are supposed to be like, he asked, amused. I suppose I did, she admitted. Rough men, not much given to conversation or thought beyond their next drink or card game. Well, I do not drink and I am terrible at cards, so I am already defying your expectations, Garrett said. As for conversation, I have always found that thinking before speaking generally leads to better outcomes. That earned him a genuine smile, the first he had seen from her, and it transformed her face entirely. He found himself smiling back, then turned away to hide his reaction. This woman had been under his roof less than a day, and already she was affecting him in ways he had not anticipated. The morning passed quietly. Garrett cleaned up the breakfast dishes, then settled in to repair some tack he had brought home from the ranch. Grace watched him work, and gradually she began to ask questions about the leather working, about the techniques he was using. It turned out she had a genuine curiosity about such things, and he found himself explaining the process in more detail than he usually would. My father was a saddle maker, she said at one point, her voice going soft with memory. Back in Ohio, before we moved to Kansas. I used to watch him work for hours. He tried to teach me, but my mother said it was not appropriate for a girl. Seems like a useful skill regardless of gender, Garrett said, carefully stitching a torn rein. That is what I thought, but there were a lot of things my mother thought were not appropriate. Grace's tone had gone sharp, and Garrett sensed old wounds there. Doc Morrison came by around noon as promised. He examined Grace's feet carefully, nodding in satisfaction at what he saw. They look good, he said. No sign of infection, which is the main thing I was worried about. Keep doing what you are doing, change the bandages regularly, and keep her off them completely for at least another 10 days. After that, we will see about letting her put some weight on them, but only gradually. After the doctor left, Garrett made lunch, and they ate together with him sitting in the chair beside the bed. Grace seemed more comfortable now, the initial awkwardness between them easing into something that felt almost natural. Tell me about yourself, she said as they ate. You know some of my story, but I know almost nothing about you except that you are kind to strange women who collapse in the street. Garrett chuckled. Not much to tell, really. I grew up in Texas, started working cattle when I was 14. Spent the next decade driving herds north, saw a good bit of the country. 3 years ago, I got tired of the wandering and decided to settle down. I had passed through Greeley the year before and liked what I saw, so I came back, got work at the Fletcher Ranch, and built this place. No family. Grace asked. Not anymore. My mother died when I was young and my father passed 5 years back. I have got a brother somewhere in California, but we have not spoken in years. He paused, then added, What about you? You said you have got no family. Grace's face clouded over. My parents both died of cholera 3 years ago, within days of each other. I was engaged to be married at the time, to a man my father had approved of. After they died, I thought at least I would have a husband to help me through the grief. She stopped, her jaw working as if the words were hard to get out. But it turned out his interest had been in my father's business, not in me. When he realized there was nothing to inherit, that my father's partner had taken over everything, he broke off the engagement rather publicly and rather cruelly. That is a terrible thing to do, Garrett said, anger flaring on her behalf. It was, Grace agreed. But it showed me who he truly was, which I suppose was a blessing in its own way. I took a position at the town school, taught for 2 years. Then the new minister decided I was not a suitable influence on young children, being a woman alone with no family and no prospects. He convinced the school board to dismiss me. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable. He suggested I should seek a husband or leave town, as if those were my only two options. So you left. So I left, Grace confirmed. I heard from another teacher about the position here, and it seemed like a chance to start fresh. I had enough money for most of the journey, but not quite all of it. I thought I could manage the last bit on foot. Obviously, that was foolish. Not foolish, Garrett said. Desperate times lead to desperate measures. You did what you had to do and you survived. That takes strength. Grace blinked rapidly and he realized she was fighting tears. You keep saying things like that and I am going to start believing them. Good, he said simply. You should believe them, because they are true. The days fell into a pattern after that. Garrett would wake early, see to Grace's needs, make breakfast, then work on various projects around the house or do small jobs for neighbors to bring in some money. Grace would read from the few books he owned, or they would talk, long conversations that ranged from philosophy to practical matters to stories from their pasts. He changed her bandages twice a day as the doctor had instructed, trying to make the process as clinical and impersonal as possible despite the intimacy of it. Grace bore it with as much dignity as she could, though he could tell she hated being so dependent on him. On the 5th day, Garrett had to go into town for supplies. He hated leaving Grace alone, but she insisted she would be fine for a few hours. He carried her to the chair by the window before he left, so she could at least look out at the street, and made sure she had water and food within reach. When he returned, he found several women from the church gathered on his porch, their faces set in expressions of barely concealed scandal. "Mr. Hawkins," said Mrs. Dorothy Patterson, the minister's wife, her voice dripping with disapproval. "We have heard you have a young woman living in your house unchaperoned. Surely you understand how inappropriate this is." Garrett set down the supplies he was carrying and met her gaze steadily. "What I understand is that Miss Barrett was injured and needed help, and I provided it. If that offends your sensibilities, then I am sorry for it, but I will not apologize for doing what was right. There are proper ways to handle such situations," another woman piped up. "She could stay at the boarding house with Mrs. Winters or with one of the families." "And who is going to pay for that?" Garrett asked. "Miss Barrett has no money and she needs constant care. I am providing that care in my home. If you would like to contribute funds to move her elsewhere, I would be happy to discuss it." The women looked at each other, and Garrett knew he had them. None of them wanted to actually spend money or take on the burden themselves. They just wanted to disapprove from a comfortable distance. "Perhaps I could stay a few hours each day, Mrs. Patterson said finally, clearly feeling she needed to offer something, for propriety's sake. "That is kind of you," Garrett said, though the last thing he wanted was this judgmental woman in his house. "But Miss Barrett is sleeping most of the time as she heals, and I think too many visitors would tire her out. Doc Morrison is pleased with her progress, and that is what matters most." He excused himself and went inside, finding Grace by the window with tears streaming down her face. "You heard that?" he asked, setting down the supplies. "I am ruining your reputation," she said miserably. "They will treat you differently now because of me." "I do not care what they think," Garrett said firmly, pulling the chair over to sit beside her. "Grace, listen to me. Those women have nothing better to do than gossip and judge. They do not know you, and they do not know me well enough either. Anyone whose opinion I actually value will understand that I am simply helping someone in need." "But they are right about one thing," Grace said, wiping at her tears. "It is not proper for me to be here alone with you." "Do you feel unsafe with me?" Garrett asked. "No," she said immediately. "Not at all. You have been nothing but respectful and kind." "Then that is all that matters. When you are healed and can walk again, You can make your own choices about where to go. Until then, you are staying right here, and I will not hear any more argument about it." Grace looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. "You are a very stubborn man, Garrett Hawkins." "So I have been told," he said with a slight smile. "Now, are you hungry? I bought some fresh vegetables from the market, and I thought I would make a stew." As he prepared the food, he was acutely aware of Grace watching him from her chair. Something had changed between them in that moment, though he could not quite name what it was. He only knew that the thought of those women trying to shame her made his blood boil, and he would defend her right to be here as long as she needed to stay. That night, after he had carried her back to bed and settled himself on his bedroll in the other room, he lay awake thinking about the situation he had gotten himself into. He had told Grace that people's opinions did not matter to him, and that was mostly true. But he was starting to realize that his own feelings were becoming complicated in ways he had not anticipated. Grace was easy to talk to, intelligent and thoughtful, with a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard sometimes. She was beautiful, even worn down by hardship and injury. And there was a strength in her, a resilience that drew him in despite his best intentions to keep things simple and uncomplicated. He told himself it was just proximity, just the natural result of spending so much time together in close quarters. But he knew he was lying to himself even as he thought it. On the 10th day, Doc Morrison declared that Grace could start trying to put a little weight on her feet, but only with support. Garrett carried her outside for the first time since she had arrived, settling her in the chair on his small porch. The late July sunshine felt good, and Grace turned her face up to it with an expression of pure bliss. "I did not realize how much I missed the sun," she said. "I know that sounds strange after I nearly killed myself walking in it, but being inside for so long made me appreciate it differently." "It does not sound strange at all," Garrett said, leaning against the porch railing. From here, they could see the main street of Greeley, people going about their business. Several of them looked toward the house with obvious curiosity, but Garrett ignored them. "Will you help me try to stand?" Grace asked after a while. "I want to see if I can do it." Garrett moved to her side, offering his hands. Grace gripped them tightly and slowly, carefully, rose from the chair. The moment her feet took her full weight, she gasped and went pale. "Easy," Garrett said, keeping his hold firm. "Do not try too much at once." "It hurts," Grace admitted through gritted teeth. "But it is bearable. I can do this." She stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, just getting used to the feeling of being upright again, before the pain became too much and Garrett helped her sit back down. "That was good," he said encouragingly. "Tomorrow you can try for longer." "Tomorrow I want to try walking," Grace said with determination. "Just a few steps, but I need to start somewhere." Over the next week they worked on it together. Garrett would wrap his arm around Grace's waist, letting her lean her weight against him, and she would take slow, painful steps across the porch. Each day she managed a little more, though he could see the effort it cost her. Her face would be drawn with pain by the end of each session, but she never complained, never asked to stop before she had pushed herself as far as she could go. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met," Garrett said one evening after a particularly difficult session. He had just settled her back in bed, and she was lying there with her eyes closed, breathing hard. "I will take that as a compliment," Grace said without opening her eyes. It was meant as one. She opened her eyes then and looked at him. "I have to get better, Garrett. I cannot stay here forever, living off your charity. I need to be able to take care of myself." "There is time," he said. "You do not need to push so hard." "Yes, I do," Grace said quietly, "because every day I stay here it gets harder to imagine leaving." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Garrett felt his heart start to beat faster and he knew he should say something, but he had no idea what. "Grace," he started, but she cut him off. "I am sorry, I should not have said that. I am just tired and not thinking clearly." But Garrett suspected she was thinking more clearly than either of them wanted to admit. He was starting to have the same problem, finding it harder and harder to remember that this arrangement was temporary, that Grace would leave as soon as she was able. The realization that he did not want her to leave hit him like a physical blow. By the end of July, Grace was able to walk slowly around the house with the aid of a cane that Garrett had carved for her. Her feet were still tender, and she could not manage long distances, but the improvement was remarkable. Doc Morrison pronounced himself very pleased with her recovery. "Another few weeks and you will be almost back to normal," he said. "You will always need to be careful with your feet, probably wear comfortable shoes for the rest of your life, but you should regain full mobility." That should have been good news, and it was, but Garrett felt a sense of impending loss that he could not shake. Grace would recover, and then she would apply for the teaching position, and she would move to the boarding house or find her own place, and this strange, intense time they had shared would be over. He tried to tell himself it was for the best. His feelings for Grace had grown far beyond simple charity or friendship, and the longer she stayed, the harder it would be when she left. But knowing something intellectually did not make it any easier emotionally. Grace seemed to be struggling with similar thoughts. She had grown quiet over the past few days, less talkative than usual. Sometimes Garrett would catch her watching him with an expression he could not quite read, something sad and longing and conflicted all at once. It came to a head one evening in early August. They had just finished dinner, and Grace was sitting on the porch with her feet elevated, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Garrett sat beside her in the other chair, ostensibly working on some leather strips, but mostly just stealing glances at her profile. "I think I am ready to meet Mr. Chen about the teaching position," Grace said suddenly. "My feet are strong enough now that I could manage a classroom." "If you think you are ready," Garrett said carefully, "then I will arrange a meeting. Thank you." Grace paused, then added, "I have been thinking about finding a place to stay. I cannot keep living here and we both know it." "Why not?" The words came out before Garrett could stop them, sharper than he intended. Grace turned to look at him, surprise and something else flickering across her face. "You know why? People are already talking. Mrs. Patterson and her friends make sure everyone knows I am staying here unchaperoned. It is not good for either of our reputations." "I told you, I do not care about that," Garrett said. "But I do," Grace said softly. "Or at least I care about what it does to you. You have been nothing but good to me, Garrett. I will not repay that by damaging your standing in this community." "And what if I said I want you to stay?" Garrett set aside the leather strips and turned to face her fully. "Not because you need help, not because of charity or obligation, but because I have gotten used to having you here and I do not want you to leave." Grace's eyes went wide. "Garrett, you cannot mean that." "Why not?" He stood up, pacing to the edge of the porch and then back, the words tumbling out now that he had started. "I know this started because you needed help, and I know the circumstances are unusual, but Grace, somewhere along the way, this became more than that. At least for me it did." "For me too," Grace whispered, and his heart leaped at the admission. "But that is exactly why I need to leave. Garrett, I came here with nothing. I still have nothing. I cannot offer you anything except more scandal and gossip." "I do not care about any of that," Garrett said, moving back to kneel beside her chair so they were at eye level. "Grace, I care about you. These past weeks, getting to know you, seeing your strength and your spirit, the way you kept fighting even when everything seemed impossible. You are remarkable and I—" He trailed off, not quite ready to say the word that was in his heart, but Grace seemed to hear it anyway. Tears were sliding down her cheeks and she reached out to touch his face, her fingers trembling. "I care about you too," she said. "So much that it scares me." "But Garrett, what kind of future could we have? You deserve someone who comes to you as an equal, not as someone you had to rescue." "You are not someone I rescued," Garrett said firmly. "You rescued yourself. You walked 3 days on ruined feet to get to a better life. I just provided a place to rest while you healed. And as for being equals, Grace, I have never met anyone more equal to me than you." "The town will never accept it," Grace said, but her protest sounded weaker now. "Then we will make them accept it," Garrett said. "Or we will not care if they do not. Grace, I am not asking you to decide anything right now. I am just asking you to stay a while longer to give us a chance to see what this could be." Grace studied his face for a long moment, her gray eyes searching. Then, slowly, she nodded. "A while longer," she agreed. "But Garrett, I need to be able to support myself. I need that teaching position, not because I want to leave you, but because I need to know I can stand on my own." "I understand that," Garrett said, "and I will help you get it. But after hours, you come home here." "To me." "To you," Grace echoed. And then she was leaning forward and so was he, and their lips met in a kiss that felt like a promise and a beginning all at once. It was gentle and sweet and tinged with all the emotion they had been holding back, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were breathless. "So we are doing this?" Grace asked, a tentative smile playing at her lips. "We are doing this," Garrett confirmed and kissed her again. The next day, true to his word, Garrett arranged for Grace to meet with Arthur Chen. The school superintendent was a thoughtful man in his mid-40s who had come to Greeley from San Francisco. He interviewed Grace thoroughly, asking about her experience and her teaching philosophy, and seemed impressed by her answers. "The position is yours if you want it," he said at the end of the meeting. "School starts in September, which gives you a few more weeks to recover fully. The salary is $30 a month plus room and board at the teacherage." Grace glanced at Garrett, who was waiting nearby, then back at Mr. Chen. "I appreciate the offer of room and board, but I have already made arrangements for lodging. If the $30 stands without the room and board, I would be grateful." Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow but nodded. "That is acceptable. The teacherage has been in poor shape anyway. I will see about getting it fixed up for the next teacher." As they walked back to Garrett's house, Grace slipped her hand into his. "Thank you for not objecting about the room and board," she said. "Your choice to make," Garrett said simply. "Though I am glad you made the one you did." The next few weeks passed in a haze of happiness that Garrett had never quite experienced before. Grace continued to heal, growing stronger each day. She began helping around the house, cooking meals and mending clothes, though Garrett insisted she rest whenever her feet started to hurt. They fell into an easy partnership, working side by side during the day and talking long into the evenings. The gossip in town grew more intense, as Garrett had known it would. More than once, he faced pointed questions or disapproving looks when he went into town for supplies. He bore it all with patience, refusing to be drawn into defending himself or Grace. What they had was no one else's business, but Grace felt the weight of it more keenly. She came back from a visit to the general store one day in late August with her face flushed and her jaw tight. "Mrs. Patterson was there," she said, sinking into a chair. She made several remarks about fallen women and men who enabled sin. Everyone in the store heard her. Garrett felt anger surge through him, hot and sharp. "Grace, I know what you are going to say," she interrupted. "That it does not matter, that we should not care what she thinks. But Garrett, I start teaching in 2 weeks. Those are the children of the people she is talking to. What if they pull their students from my classroom because of this? It was a legitimate concern and one Garrett did not have a good answer for. He sat down across from her, thinking hard. Finally, he said, "There is one way to silence the gossip for good." Grace looked at him questioningly. "Marry me," Garrett said. "I know it is fast. I know this is not the most romantic proposal, but Grace, I love you. I think I have loved you since the day I carried you off that stagecoach. Marry me, and let Mrs. Patterson and everyone else know that we have done nothing wrong." Grace stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Garrett, you cannot propose just to stop gossip. Marriage is too important for that." "I am not proposing just to stop gossip," Garrett said, moving to kneel in front of her chair. "I am proposing because I want to spend my life with you." The gossip just makes the timing more urgent than it might have been otherwise. "Grace, I know my own heart. Do you know yours?" "Yes," Grace said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I do. I love you too, Garrett. I think I started falling in love with you the first time you stood up to those church women, defending me when you barely knew me. And every day since then, I have fallen more deeply." "Then marry me," Garrett said again. "Say yes." "Yes," Grace said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." They wed a week later, on a Sunday afternoon at the small church in Greeley. Garrett wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, and Grace wore a simple blue dress that one of the kinder women in town had helped her make. Doc Morrison stood as witness, along with Arthur Chen and his wife. Notably absent were Mrs. Patterson and most of her circle, though a surprising number of people did attend, including Frank Fletcher and his family. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife and Garrett kissed his bride, he felt a sense of rightness settle over him that he had never experienced before. This was where he was meant to be, with this woman by his side. They held a small reception at the house afterward, with food and conversation. Frank Fletcher pulled Garrett aside at one point and clapped him on the shoulder. "You are a braver man than most," Frank said, "standing up to the gossips the way you did. But I have watched how you and your wife are together, and it is clear you two belong to each other. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise." "I do not intend to," Garrett said, looking across the room to where Grace was talking with Mrs. Chen. She met his eyes and smiled, and he felt his heart expand in his chest. Grace started teaching in September, and to Garrett's relief and her own, the parents kept their children enrolled. If anything, the fact that she was now respectably married seemed to have appeased most of the critics. She proved to be an excellent teacher, patient and creative, and the children adored her. Garrett continued his work at the Fletcher Ranch, but he came home every evening to a house that now felt truly like a home. Grace would have dinner ready, though he always helped with the dishes, and they would spend the evenings reading or talking or simply sitting together, enjoying the comfort of each other's presence. The first time Grace said she was too tired to walk home from school and asked Garrett to carry her, he swept her up into his arms without hesitation. It reminded them both of those early days when she had been so injured, but now there was joy in it instead of desperation. He carried her the 3 blocks from the schoolhouse to their home, ignoring the stares and whispers, and Grace laughed the whole way. "People are going to think you are very strange," she said, her arms looped around his neck. "Let them," Garrett said. "I carried you when you could not walk, and I will carry you whenever you want me to, for the rest of our lives if that is what you wish." "I wish," Grace said softly, and kissed his cheek. It became something of a pattern after that. Some days Grace would walk home on her own, but other days, especially when her feet were bothering her, Garrett would show up at the school just as she was finishing and carry her home. The children thought it was wonderfully romantic, and eventually even some of the town gossips started to see it as a charming eccentricity rather than a scandal. Their first Christmas together was simple but perfect. Garrett surprised Grace with a beautifully tooled leather journal he had made himself, with her initials embossed on the cover. Grace gave him a warm winter coat she had sewn, with careful stitching that showed how much thought she had put into every detail. On Christmas night, sitting by the fire in their small house, Grace made an announcement that changed everything. "I am with child," she said softly, taking Garrett's hand and placing it on her still flat stomach. "Doc Morrison confirmed it today. The baby should arrive in late June or early July." Garrett felt joy surge through him so powerfully he could not speak for a moment. Then he pulled Grace into his arms, holding her close and pressing his face into her hair. "I am going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "And I am going to be a mother," Grace said, pulling back to look at him with shining eyes. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Garrett said and kissed her deeply. "Grace, you have given me everything. A home, a family, a life I never imagined I could have." "We gave each other that," Grace corrected. "You saved my life, Garrett, not just by helping me when I was injured, but by showing me that I could be loved for who I am, not for what I could offer. You gave me a second chance." The months of Grace's pregnancy passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. She continued teaching until May, when the school year ended, and then settled in to wait for the baby. Her feet bothered her more as her pregnancy advanced, the extra weight making them ache, so Garrett carried her more frequently. He did not mind at all. If anything, he cherished these moments of closeness, of being able to care for her in this tangible way. Their son was born on July 3rd, 1877, almost exactly a year after Grace had arrived in Greeley. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Garrett feared he might lose her, but Doc Morrison was skilled and Grace was strong, and finally, after hours of struggle, a baby's cry filled the small house. "A boy," the doctor said, placing the squalling infant on Grace's chest. "A healthy boy." Grace looked down at their son with exhaustion and wonder in her eyes, then up at Garrett. What should we name him? They had discussed names but had not settled on one. Now, looking at this tiny new person they had created together, Garrett knew exactly what felt right. "James," he said, "after my father. James Garrett Hawkins." "James," Grace repeated, smiling. "That is perfect." Being a father was harder than Garrett had anticipated, but also more rewarding. Young James was a colicky baby who did not sleep well, which meant neither of his parents slept well either. But even in the exhausting fog of those early months, Garrett would not have traded it for anything. He would wake in the night to find Grace nursing the baby, her face soft in the lamplight, and feel such love it nearly overwhelmed him. Grace recovered slowly from the birth, and her feet gave her more trouble than before. Some days she could barely walk at all, the old injuries aggravated by the pregnancy. On those days, Garrett would carry her from room to room, from bed to chair to table, and he did it gladly. It became second nature, anticipating when she would need help, being there to provide it without making her feel diminished. When James was 3 months old, Grace decided she wanted to return to teaching. She loved being a mother, but she also missed the intellectual stimulation of the classroom. They worked out an arrangement where a neighbor woman, Mrs. Hewitt, would watch James during school hours in exchange for some of Grace's salary. The first day back was hard for Grace, leaving her son with someone else, but she came home energized in a way Garrett had not seen since before the baby was born. She told him about her students, about the lessons she had planned, and her whole face lit up with enthusiasm. "Thank you for supporting this," she said that evening as they sat together after putting James to bed. "Not all husbands would." "You are more than just a wife and mother," Garrett said. "You are a teacher and a person with your own dreams. I would never ask you to give that up." Grace kissed him tenderly. "I chose well when I chose you, Garrett Hawkins." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. James grew into a curious, energetic toddler who kept them both on their toes. When he was 2, Grace became pregnant again, and their daughter Martha was born in the spring of 1880. 2 years after that came another son, William, and then finally, when Grace was 32, a surprise daughter they named Catherine. Garrett expanded the house as the family grew, adding rooms so each child could have their own space. He continued to work at the Fletcher Ranch, eventually becoming foreman, and he and Grace saved diligently. They were never wealthy, but they were comfortable, and more importantly, they were happy. Grace had to stop teaching when the children became too numerous and demanding, but she remained involved with the school, serving on the board and organizing events. Her feet never fully recovered their strength, and there were days when the pain was significant. On those days, Garrett would carry her just as he had in those early weeks after they met. The children found it endlessly amusing to see their father carrying their mother around the house or even occasionally into town. "Why do you carry Mama so much?" James asked when he was about 8 years old. Garrett set Grace down gently in her chair and turned to his son. "Because when I first met your mother, she had walked so far and so bravely to get to a new life that her feet were damaged. I carried her then because she could not walk, and I carry her now because I want to, because I love her, and it is one way I can show that love." "That is very romantic," Martha said dreamily. She was 6 and already showing signs of her mother's romantic nature. "It is practical," Grace said with a laugh. "Your father knows I am stubborn and will push myself too hard if left to my own devices. This way, I have no choice but to rest my feet." But there was more to it than practicality, and they both knew it. The carrying had become a symbol of their relationship, of the way they supported each other through everything. Grace carried emotional burdens for Garrett, listening when he had difficult days at work, offering wisdom and perspective. Garrett carried physical burdens for Grace, literally lifting her up when her body would not cooperate. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Garrett surprised Grace by carrying her all the way to the top of a nearby hill where they could watch the sunset over Greeley and the plains beyond. The children were with a neighbor for the evening, giving them rare time alone together. "You ever regret it?" Grace asked as they sat together watching the sky turn crimson and gold. "Taking me in that day? Your life would have been simpler without me." "Simpler, maybe," Garrett said, pulling her close. "But not better, never better. Grace, you and the children are my life. Everything good I have came from the moment I carried you off that stagecoach." "I was so scared that day," Grace admitted. "I thought I had ruined everything, destroyed my last chance at a new life. And then you appeared like something out of a story and you just took care of everything. You took care of me." "We took care of each other," Garrett corrected. "You gave me purpose and family and love." "That is not a one-sided exchange." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky fading from gold to purple to deep blue. In the distance, they could see the lights of Greeley coming on, marking the homes and businesses that made up their town. It had grown considerably in the 10 years since Grace had arrived, more than doubling in population. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had not stopped to help me?" Grace asked quietly. "No," Garrett said firmly. "Because I cannot imagine a world where I would have walked past you. It would have been impossible. You were meant to come into my life that day, and I was meant to be there to help you. Everything else followed from that one moment. As they grew older, their love only deepened. The children grew up strong and healthy, each one inheriting different traits from their parents. James had his father's steady nature and his mother's intelligence. Martha was romantic and dreamy, but also practical when needed. William was adventurous and curious about everything. And little Catherine, the baby, was fierce and independent, already showing signs that she would forge her own path in life. Grace's feet continued to give her trouble as she aged, arthritis setting into the old injuries. By the time she was 40, she could rarely walk more than a few steps without pain. But Garrett's strength had not diminished, and he continued to carry her whenever and wherever she needed to go. "You are going to hurt your back," Grace would protest whenever he swept her up. "Not yet, I will not," Garrett would respond and carry her anyway. The children grew up and began to make their own lives. James went to work at the Fletcher Ranch with his father, showing the same dedication and skill with cattle. Martha married a young lawyer who had come to Greeley to set up practice, and they settled in a house just down the street. William decided he wanted to see more of the country and went to work for the railroad, though he came home frequently to visit. Catherine, true to her independent nature, declared she wanted to go to college back east to study medicine, an ambition that made both her parents proud even as they worried about her being so far from home. On a warm evening in July 1899, Garrett and Grace sat on their porch watching the sunset, as had become their custom. They were both in their early 50s now, their hair showing streaks of gray, their faces marked by years of life and love and laughter. 22 years, Grace said softly, her hand in Garrett's. 22 years since I stumbled off that stagecoach with ruined feet and no prospects. 22 years since the best day of my life, Garrett said, the day I met you. You could not have known that then, Grace said with a smile. Could I not? Garrett turned to look at her, his weathered face serious. Grace, I knew something important was happening the moment I caught you before you fell. I did not know exactly what, but I knew my life was changing. And I have never regretted a single moment of it. Not even when James broke your favorite saddle trying to ride that wild Mustang. Not even then, Garrett said with a chuckle. Though I will admit, I was tempted to regret it in that moment. They laughed together, the sound warm and comfortable. In the street below, they could see their grandchildren playing, Martha's 3 children along with a couple of neighbor kids. The shrieks and laughter of childhood drifted up to them on the evening breeze. We made a good life, Grace said quietly. Against all odds, we made a really good life. We did, Garrett agreed, and we are not done yet. We have got years ahead of us still. But life, as always, had its own plans. The following winter was harsh, and Grace caught a respiratory illness that settled deep in her chest. Doc Morrison, now an elderly man himself, did what he could, but Grace's lungs had never been strong, damaged by the exposure during her 3-day walk all those years ago. Garrett barely left her side during those long weeks. He carried her from bed to chair and back again, trying to make her comfortable. The children came to visit, bringing the grandchildren, and Grace rallied for their visits, but Garrett could see she was growing weaker. One evening in February 1900, as snow fell softly outside their window, Grace beckoned Garrett close. "Promise me something," she whispered, her voice hoarse from coughing. "Anything," Garrett said, clutching her hand. "Promise me you will keep living after I am gone. Do not spend the rest of your life grieving. You have so much to give, so much love to share with the children and grandchildren. Promise me you will let yourself be happy." "Grace, do not talk like that. You are going to recover," Garrett said, even though he knew the truth in his heart. "Promise me," Grace insisted, her gray eyes, still beautiful even faded with illness, locking onto his. "I promise," Garrett said, tears streaming down his face. "But Grace, I need you to know that you have been the love of my life. From the moment I carried you off that stagecoach, you have been everything to me. I would do it all again, every moment, just for the chance to love you. And I would walk those 3 days again, feet and all, knowing they would lead me to you," Grace said. She smiled, that same smile that had first captivated him all those years ago. "Carry me one more time, Garrett. Carry me to the window. I want to see the snow." Garrett gently lifted his wife from the bed, cradling her in his arms the way he had so many thousands of times over their years together. He carried her to the window and stood there with her, both of them watching the snow fall silently over Greeley, blanketing everything in white. Grace rested her head against his shoulder, and Garrett felt her breathing slow and deepen. He held her there, unwilling to move, unwilling to let go. Outside, the world turned white and peaceful, and inside, Garrett held the woman who had been his whole world for nearly a quarter-century. Grace passed quietly in his arms that night, her head still resting against his shoulder, her hand still clasped in his. When Doc Morrison came in the morning and gently told Garrett he could put her down now, Garrett shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "Just a little while longer." So he carried his wife one final time, carrying her back to their bed and laying her down with infinite gentleness and care. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at her peaceful face, remembering the scared, injured young woman she had been and the strong, loving partner she had become. The grief was profound, deeper than anything Garrett had ever experienced, but he kept his promise to Grace. He did not withdraw from life. He threw himself into his relationships with his children and grandchildren, sharing stories about their mother and grandmother, keeping her memory alive and vibrant. He continued working at the ranch for several more years, until his own body told him it was time to slow down. James took over most of the physical work, and Garrett transitioned into an advisory role, his decades of experience proving valuable. On warm evenings, he would sit on the porch and watch the sunset, often with a grandchild or two beside him. They would ask about their grandmother, and Garrett would tell them about the day she arrived in Greeley with bandaged feet, about how he carried her, and how that simple act of kindness blossomed into the deepest love he had ever known. Was it hard? His granddaughter Sarah asked one evening when she was about 10 years old. "Carrying Grandma so much?" "No," Garrett said honestly. "It was never hard. It was the easiest thing in the world because I loved her. When you love someone, caring for them is not a burden, it is a privilege." Martha's daughter nodded thoughtfully. "I want someone to love me like that someday." "You will," Garrett assured her, "and you will love them back just as fiercely. That is the Hawkins way." As the new century progressed, bringing changes that would have been unimaginable in 1876, Garrett remained a fixture in Greeley. He lived to see automobiles replace horses on many streets, to see electricity come to more and more homes, to see the world transform around him. But through it all, he carried with him the memory of those early days with Grace, when life had been simpler, but no less meaningful. He passed peacefully in his sleep in 1913 at the age of 66, surrounded by his children and many of his grandchildren. His last words were a whisper that only James, leaning close, could hear. "I am coming, Grace. I will carry you again soon." The family buried him next to Grace in the Greeley Cemetery under a large cottonwood tree. The headstone was simple but perfect, reading, "Garrett Hawkins. Beloved husband, father, and grandfather. He carried her with love." The story of Garrett and Grace became something of a legend in Greeley, passed down through generations. People would point out the house where they had lived, tell the story of how they met, how Garrett had defied convention and gossip to care for a stranger who became his wife. It became a symbol of what true love could look like, practical and everyday, but also profound and transformative. Their children and grandchildren carried on their legacy in different ways. James continued the ranching tradition, becoming one of the most respected cattlemen in Colorado. Martha became involved in women's suffrage, inspired by her mother's strength and independence. William's work with the railroad helped connect communities across the West. And Catherine became one of Colorado's first female doctors, opening a practice in Denver that served immigrant communities who might otherwise have had no medical care. Each of them, in their own way, embodied the lessons their parents had taught them. That kindness matters, that love requires action, not just words, that we are measured by how we treat those in need, and that true partnership means carrying each other's burdens with grace and without resentment. On the 50th anniversary of Garrett and Grace's wedding, the family gathered in Greeley for a reunion. There were dozens of them now, children and grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. They visited the cemetery, laying flowers on the graves, and then gathered at the old house, which James still maintained. The youngest great-grandchild, a little girl of 4 named Grace after her great-grandmother, asked her grandmother Martha to tell the story again. "Tell me about how great-grandpa carried great-grandma," she said, her eyes wide with interest. So Martha told the story once more, about the young woman with bandaged feet who arrived in Greeley with nothing but determination, about the cowboy who caught her when she fell and never truly put her down, about the love that grew between them against all odds and lasted until death and beyond. And the moral of the story, Martha concluded, looking around at all the faces of her family, is that love is not just a feeling. Love is action. Love is showing up day after day, carrying each other through the hard times, celebrating the good times together, and never giving up on each other. That is what your great-grandparents taught us, and that is what we try to live by. Little Grace nodded solemnly, processing this wisdom in the way children do. Then she smiled, that same bright smile that had been passed down through the generations from the original Grace. "When I grow up, I want to find someone who will carry me like that," she said. "You will, sweetheart," Martha assured her. "And more importantly, you will carry them right back. That is what real love is. It goes both ways." As the sun set over Greeley that evening, the family gathered on the porch of the old house, several generations together, all of them products of a love story that had started with one simple act of kindness on a dusty street in July 1876. The legacy of Garrett and Grace lived on in each of them, in their capacity for compassion, their resilience in the face of hardship, and their understanding that love, real love, is both the grandest adventure and the most ordinary, everyday choice we make. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, Garrett held Grace in his arms once more, carrying her through eternity as he had carried her through life, with devotion and joy and a love that death itself could not diminish. They had found each other against impossible odds, had built a life and family together, and had shown everyone who knew them what it meant to truly love another person with your whole heart. The story of the cowboy who carried the woman with bandaged feet became more than just a family tale. It became part of Greeley's history, a reminder of the town's early days and the people who had helped build it. Historians would later include it in books about the settling of Colorado, using it as an example of the resilience and community spirit that characterized the frontier. But for the Hawkins family, it was never just a historical anecdote. It was the foundation of who they were, the root from which they all grew. Every time one of them faced a difficult decision, They would think about Garrett choosing to help Grace despite the inconvenience and potential scandal. Every time one of them was tempted to care too much about what others thought, they remembered how Garrett and Grace had defied gossip and judgment to build their life together. The house eventually became a museum of sorts, preserved by the family and later by the Historical Society. Visitors could see the room where Grace had recovered, the porch where Garrett had proposed, the window where he had carried her one last time to watch the snow. School groups would tour through, learning about life in early Colorado, and teachers would tell the story of Garrett and Grace as an example of the human dramas that played out against the backdrop of Western expansion. But more than any museum display or history book entry, the real legacy of Garrett and Grace lived on in the hearts and lives of their descendants. It lived on every time someone in the family went out of their way to help a stranger. It lived on every time they chose love over pride, compassion over judgment, action over indifference. The values they embodied, kindness, resilience, partnership, and unwavering love, became the inheritance they passed down, more valuable than any material wealth. And in a world that was constantly changing, becoming faster and more complex with each passing year, those timeless values remained as relevant and necessary as they had been on that dusty July day in 1876. Years turned into decades, and the 20th century brought changes that would have astounded Garrett and Grace. Their descendants saw world wars and space travel, civil rights movements and technological revolutions. The world they had known disappeared, replaced by something unrecognizable. But through it all, the story endured, adapted and retold for new generations, but always carrying the same essential truth at its core. Love is not convenient. Love is not always romantic in the way stories make it seem. But love, real love, is the most powerful force in human experience. It is the choice to catch someone when they fall. It is the commitment to carry them when they cannot carry themselves. It is the daily decision to honor and cherish another person, not because they are perfect, but because you have chosen them and they have chosen you. That was what Garrett and Grace taught through their lives together. Not through grand gestures, though carrying his wife around town certainly qualified as one, but through the accumulation of small, daily acts of love and devotion. Through patience and understanding, through supporting each other's dreams, through facing hardships together and celebrating joys together. And so the story continued, passed down from great-grandparents to grandparents to parents to children, an eternal testament to the power of compassion and the enduring nature of true love. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, it was a reminder that goodness exists, that people can be kind to strangers, and that sometimes, if you are very lucky, a moment of crisis can become the beginning of the greatest love story ever told. The tale of she who arrived with bandaged feet, and the cowboy who carried her, and never put her down became more than just a family history or a local legend. It became a symbol of hope, a proof that even in our darkest moments, when we are at our most vulnerable and defeated, we might find the person who will lift us up and carry us forward into a brighter future. And that truth, more than anything else, was why the story endured, why it continued to be told, why it still had the power to move hearts and inspire actions more than a century after it began. Because everyone, at some point in their lives, needs to be carried. And everyone, at some point, has the opportunity to do the carrying. The story of Garrett and Grace reminded us to embrace both roles with equal grace and gratitude. In the end, their legacy was not just in the children they raised or the businesses they built or the community they helped create. Their legacy was in the example they set. an example that continued to ripple outward through time, touching lives they would never know, inspiring love stories they would never hear about, but which existed in part because their story had been told and retold, keeping alive the possibility that love, true and lasting love, was not just a fairy tale but a real, achievable thing worth fighting for. And so, as the sun sets over Greeley, Colorado, now a modern city that bears little resemblance to the rough frontier town it once was, the spirits of Garrett and Grace Hawkins rest peacefully in their graves beneath the cottonwood tree, secure in the knowledge that they lived fully, loved deeply, and left behind something far more valuable than gold or land or fame. They left behind a legacy of love that would never die, carried forward through generations, inspiring others to choose kindness, to offer help, to catch those who fall, and to carry them for as long as they need to be carried. That was their gift to the world, and it was more than enough.